even though a fine violin can last forever. The fingerboard can be worn out about every 20 years by a professional violinist, and every couple years before that, the fingerboard will need to have the grooves and the hollows smoothed out that are formed by the fingers pounding upon the strings and the fingerboard. And this particular violin has been played for over 22 years, quite aggressively, and so, as you can see, it's way overdue. There's also a number of other items that this violin needs, and if you wonder about those, check out my violin maintenance and repair playlist on YouTube. Anytime that you have to remove the strings off of a violin, make a list of all of the repairs and adjustments that the instrument needs. This will save you a lot of grief later on, especially if you make a full list and check each item off before putting the strings back on. Also, when the strings are off, plan on making any sound adjustments that the instrument might need, which also means that you'll need to have sound post tools available and know how to use them in case the sound post falls with all of the tension off the violin, which is very common. So let's get started by removing the chin rest and all of the strings. And it's best to place something soft under the tailpiece so when you loosen the strings it doesn't fall against the belly and scratch it. And especially on old instruments, it's best to lower the pitch gradually just so it's not as big of a shock to the instrument. And I'll set the bridge aside. Just quickly wipe off any rosin dust. And as you can see, this one needs the caked rosin cleaned off of the entire instrument. And I'll do that now, as well as most of the touch-up, so that the ebony dust won't get into the pores of the raw wood showing on this instrument. I love this part because there is nothing that can compare to all of the feelings that you experience while bringing fine old violin varnish back to life. Instead of looking abused and neglected, it's as though you can now see right into the soul of the instrument and then experience its ageless beauty to the fullest. Even if you don't have to clean the instrument itself, you'll definitely want to clean off any leftover rosin on the fingerboard with a little denatured alcohol and a soft cotton cloth, while always being extremely careful to never drip or touch against the body or scroll of the instrument. Even though it is possible to refinish any fingerboard without removing the nut, and with an elevated amount of skill and special tools to carve right up to the nut and finish there, it's almost always quicker and better to remove the nut before refinishing the fingerboard. Normally, removing a nut on a violin isn't as big of a deal as you might think, though in this particular case it looks like the nut has really been glued on tight, and so this is probably a great example for showing the different techniques. Don't be too surprised if on an older restoration you pull the strings off and the nut literally falls off by itself, or with just a little help comes off. But much more often, what it takes is a parting knife. Parting knives are very thin, hard blades that are sharpened and then have their edge ever so slightly dulled so that they don't cut. And these are used to open seams on violins or to pull off the different parts that have been glued together with hide glue. When you go to apply pressure against the seam, make sure that the edge of the parting knife against the scroll is parallel with the joint so that it doesn't cut into the scroll as the blade moves in or damage the nut as the blade moves in. The goal is to simply separate the glue along that joint. And as a precaution, you may want to consider cutting off a piece of yellow sticky to protect the top surfaces of the peg box. And if you do, leave a small gap at the bottom so it allows the edge to get down at the proper angle against that joint. And after double checking your angle and making sure that the blade sits flat against both sides of the peg box, bring the blade right up against the edge of the nut and start working on the joint back and forth while applying pressure, and about half of all nuts will come off at that point. Make sure everything is supported very well, and notice how I place the back of the scroll against the edge of the bench on a thick cloth, and with a fair amount of pressure and working it back and forth, about half of all nuts would come off at that point. But as I mentioned before, this one looks like it is really glued on there. So we'll use the traditional approach of tapping the back of the parting knife with a small tack hammer, which will send a shock wave through the hide glue and separate the joint. And there, as you can see, the nut popped right off. And with just the slightest amount of cleanup, this nut can be glued right back on, and you'll never know the difference. It can vary a little, yet the scoop of a violin fingerboard should be about 0.5 millimeters directly under the E string. There's almost no scoop here, but it works out perfectly anyway, because by the time I remove the grooves and hollows, the scoop will be just right if I don't remove much material from each end. The scoop should be about 1.0 millimeters under the G string, and the same thing applies here. By the time I remove the grooves and hollows, and maybe just a little off of each end, the scoop should end up just right. If you make or refinish a lot of fingerboards, you may want to consider purchasing a dial indicator and making a simple gauge like this one that can quickly and easily measure the depth of the scoop on the fingerboard. The top radius of a fingerboard should be around 41 millimeters, and, if anything, slightly flatter at the end by the bridge. The arc on this fingerboard isn't terrible, yet definitely needs flattened, especially in the center and toward this end by the nut. One of the trade secrets of surfacing a fingerboard is that the deepest part of the scoop is closer to the nut by as much as 34 millimeters and resembles a nicely cambered bow more than a perfect arc. This allows for the lowest string height possible without the strings buzzing against the fingerboard. Before you begin removing material, you need to support the violin and the scroll so both of your hands are free. If you don't have a cradle, yet you do have someone to help you, all this takes is a couple pieces of velvet and your imagination. Or, if you do have a cradle, make sure that the scroll is firmly supported. Even if your fingerboard needs a lot of work and needs planed, it's still a good idea to get familiar with the sanding sticks with and without sandpaper, since for most fingerboards, these are the only shaping and smoothing tools that you'll need. Sanding sticks are made from 1/4-inch masonite and can vary in length and width, depending upon the length of your sandpaper sheets and what feels good in your hands. I've used many different sanding sticks, but this is the range of sizes that I've used for over the past 20 years to both make and resurface all my fingerboards, including those for violas and cellos. I cut the sandpaper just a little wider than the sanding sticks with an old pair of scissors. A bit of advice though, don't use your mother's nice scissors on sandpaper. I used to glue the sandpaper to the bottom surface of the sticks, yet found that if I crease the edges like this, the sandpaper stays in place just fine. I can also trade out the sandpaper as often as I want, and it gives my fingers a much better grip as I flex the ends and push down against the fingerboard. I use soft cotton cloths to protect the instrument and keep the ebony dust off of it. I also wear a dust mask or a respirator to protect my lungs, since ebony dust is poisonous to breathe. Make sure to flex the wood just enough to not touch either end of the fingerboard while moving back and forth, and to make sure to practice for a few minutes with 220 grit sandpaper so you can see how much wood will need to be removed. If you start with 220 grit sandpaper, it plugs up quickly, so don't be surprised if you have to clean or replace it after only a few swipes. But it's worth the investment to gain a little experience. For light wear on fingerboards, 220 grit sandpaper is all that's necessary to smooth out all the grooves and hollows, which is not the case here. Some of the best 80 to 100 grit sandpaper comes from large belt sanders. Just make sure to discard any seams or damaged areas when cutting them up. The more aggressive sandpapers will allow you to reshape the top surface, which also means that you can do a lot of damage. So make sure that your stance is solid, take your time, and never let the sandpaper come in contact with the fingerboard without the ends being flexed up and the bottom surface curved. And most importantly, never touch the scroll. If you feel uncomfortable about hitting it, add another layer of cloth or even a plastic bag on top of it. And by now, you should have a good idea how much work it's going to take to reshape the fingerboard. This is about as bad as it gets, and I plan on spending about 15 minutes getting the arc and scoop just right. Make sure to keep checking both the arc and the scoop along the way. And if this is your very first time, plan on checking them about a dozen times. Notice how I focus on the center to flatten the fingerboard, yet still keep moving from side to side to smooth and follow the shape of the arc. I made this new fixture so that I could get the proper camera angles while resurfacing the fingerboard, and it needs to be a little bit more stable, especially when working side to side. So give me a couple minutes. I also added a piece of tape to the cloth since I'm having to do so much work on this fingerboard. Brushing diagonally with the sanding stick when you're nearing the end helps to remove any small ridges or irregularities. Once all of the grooves and hollows are gone, use 220 grit sandpaper to remove all of the scratches created by the coarser grit sandpapers. To make sure that there are no tiny waves or irregularities in the arc, the next step is to sand perpendicular to the fingerboard with a narrow strip of 220 grit sandpaper about 1 inch wide. And the warning is the same as it was with the sanding sticks. Begin by not sanding all of the way to the edges. While sanding side to side, keep the sandpaper moving with as even pressure as possible so that you don't dig in with the edges. And keep sanding across until all of the parallel sanding marks are gone. Make sure to wipe off any dust when checking for sandpaper marks, because at this stage, dust tends to make the surface look better than it really is. Also, you want to check for scratches in as harsh of light as possible. Next, go lengthwise with 220 grit sandpaper backed by a medium-sized piece of cork, no larger than this one, until all of the perpendicular scratches are gone. Or, once again, if you do a lot of fingerboards, a radiused cork sanding block is even better. Just make sure that the radius of the cork is slightly larger than 41 millimeters. Also, when you form the bottom surface of the sanding block, make it slightly rounded lengthwise to allow it to follow the scoop of the fingerboard properly. Then touch up and finish removing any leftover cross scratches with a small piece of cork and 220 grit sandpaper. The top corners of the fingerboard need radiused, or at least double-checked, and the radius on the base side should be 0.045 inches or 1.1 millimeters at the nut, and gradually decrease down to 0.035 inches or 0.9 millimeters next to the bridge. The treble radius next to the nut should be 0.035 inches or 0.9 millimeters, and it gradually decreases down to 0.025 inches or 0.6 millimeters next to the bridge. If you don't have radius gauges, visually follow these examples, and if the radii are too large to begin with, even after resurfacing the fingerboard, just lightly blend the shape the best you can. Don't take any more material off the top surface of the fingerboard in an effort to make the radii smaller. I roughly form each radius using a well-worn sanding block and 220 grit sandpaper. And I make each radius slightly smaller than it should be, so that I can finish them to size using 400 grit sandpaper. The last time that I sand perpendicular to the fingerboard is with 400 grit sandpaper, and I make sure to lighten the pressure before going on. All finish sanding is done with medium-sized cork using finer and finer sandpaper, and all motions are with the grain. And once again, reduce the pressure each time before going on to the next finer grit size. And if everything has been done properly, when you look down the top surface of the fingerboard, it will be as smooth as glass everywhere and reflect like a mirror. Keep your respirator on until you finish cleaning up. And there, you can hear the sound post rattling around inside. Always glue the nut on with genuine hide glue, so that it can be removed over and over again without damaging the instrument. All it takes is a very small light swipe of glue, and the glue should not squeeze out all over the place as you place it. Perfectly even from side to side. No clamps are necessary. That was shameless. Yet, Two Trees really is the most endearing and emotionally satisfying legend about music and master violins ever. Lowering and reshaping the top of the nut to match the new surface of the fingerboard will remove most of this old damage. And this is done by using a flat sanding block and, once again, progressively finer and finer sandpaper. Especially if this is your first time, it's best to protect the top of the peg box with a piece of electrical tape. And don't forget to wear a dust mask or respirator. Begin by carefully sanding the top surface of the nut down to the dimensions shown at an angle of about 3 degrees with 220 grit sandpaper. I only work while looking across the top of the nut at a light background, and I'm showing the motion without any sandpaper so that you can see it more clearly. This is especially critical when radiusing the nut close to the scroll. If you don't have calipers or a protractor, visually compare your work with the drawing and the examples. If anything, stay a little bit on the high side and do the best that you can, since that's how most violin makers have been shaping ebony nuts for almost 500 years. Next, re-radius the top of the nut so that each of the strings will clear the surface as they leave the nut and go down into the peg box, while realizing that each of the strings enters the peg box at a different angle and makes the shape of the face uneven from side to side, which is one of the marks of the masters. And even if you have tape on the peg box, this is where you have to be really careful. I always use one of my other fingers as a guide and as a stop to keep me from touching the scroll. After using 220 grit and 400 grit sandpaper to finish the shape and height of the nut, go over the surface with a small piece of folded 600 grit sandpaper. Then use this sandpaper to form a small chamfer on the corner next to the fingerboard. Double check the spacing of the strings and keep in mind that you can compensate left or right a little while cutting and filing the grooves to depth. There's more to the grooves than meets the eye, and hopefully pausing on and studying these 2 additional drawings will help answer most of your questions. The grooves are started with a thin, sharp knife, which allows you to easily move the grooves from side to side. Check the spacing with a template as you go, and when you feel good about it, take each of the grooves almost to depth with a fine, sharp-edged triangular file, since radiused files tend to wander at shallow depths. Finish the grooves with radius files, or, if you use very short strokes, needle files, slightly smaller than each string, while remembering to taper down slightly into the peg box, and, as the groove leaves the radius of the nut, swerve until the end of the file points to the inside edge of the peg box where that particular peg goes through. My burnishers are made from old bandsaw blades with a radius slightly smaller than the radius of the string. If you press fairly hard, it compresses the ebony and the strings will glide freely through them. Graphite is used to lubricate the grooves, so make sure to work it in really well. And don't forget to turn the pencil around to catch the edge next to the fingerboard. Then burnish and graphite all the grooves again before going on. Go over the nut one last time with 1200 grit sandpaper, and it's ready to polish along with the fingerboard. The filler in the ebony polish settles to the bottom, so make sure that you stir it thoroughly. It can be applied with cloth, yet I use a couple squares of folded bathroom tissue. The amount isn't critical, but don't put on so much that it might drip onto the varnish. Though if it does, it's not like alcohol. Just wipe it off quickly and there's almost never a problem. After applying it liberally to the top of the fingerboard and nut, and rubbing it in thoroughly, I then use a single piece of folded tissue where more accuracy is required, especially along the edge of the fingerboard and around the nut, though I sometimes squeeze some out onto the glue joint next to the peg box as a form of touch-up for the parting knife. Just make sure to wipe it off fairly quickly. After just a couple minutes, use fresh tissue paper to wipe off the excess and keep rubbing until the entire surface becomes a glossy jet black. And to see just how good this process really is for making or refinishing fingerboards, place a couple yellow stickies to protect the varnish and take a look, since most fingerboards will have waves and unevenness. What you see here is the perfect transition of the scoop from the E to the G side of the fingerboard with no waves. And a quick look from the other end, because even though art is subjective, every professional violinist needs and deserves to have a perfect fingerboard. Re-graphite the grooves to get any leftover polish out, re-burnish and then re-graphite one last time, and the nut and the fingerboard are finished. Make sure to check everything off your to-do list, including resetting the sound post. Replace the strings, hopefully with new ones. Double check the tilt of the bridge. Replace the chin rest and let the strings settle in. Adjust the peg angles. And this fine violin is ready, once again, for the concert hall.